welcome to In Real Lore. My name is Nirlo, and I'll be going over the lore of various stories and different worlds that exist that we like to delve into. Today, I will be going over House of the Dragon and Fire and Blood, the novel by George R. R. Martin, and the recent hit series on HBO, the prequel to Game of Thrones. And the reason why I like to go over these things is because lore is something that we can all kind of dig into a little bit. Lore is something that is usually supplemental to a story that we find incredibly interesting and we want to know more about. So in this series, I will be going over multiple stories and the lore around them and what makes them interesting and what makes us more interested in the lore because of the stories themselves. Today, like I said, we'll be going over House of the Dragon. And the main driver for me here looking into it is why House of the Dragon initially existed. Why was it something that needed to come about? We have a Game of Thrones, which was a massive success, except for the last two seasons. And the seasons 1 to 4 were incredibly well done. But what made the lore of this world so compelling that we wanted a show that is just the history, that is just the background to the main story, which is A Song of Ice and Fire. When we know where the story is going, and especially in this case of House of the Dragon, what tension really is there and why do we want to look into it? What makes something where we know the end more interesting? Now, the first thing I kind of want to highlight in regards to this is about Martin himself as an author. When he began writing Game of Thrones in the mid-90s, it came out in 1996, he didn't have an idea of where things were really going to end up. He had a little bit of a setup, but that was it. And this is mostly because of the fact that he is a gardener. Now, to explain this is a quote directly from himself. I think there are two types of writers, the architects and the gardeners. The architects plan everything ahead of time, like an architect building a house. They have the whole thing designed and blueprinted out before they even nail the first board up. The gardeners dig a hole, drop in a seed, and water it. They kind of know what a seed is. They know if they planted a fantasy seed or a mystery seed or whatever. But the plant comes up and they water it. They don't know how many branches it's going to have. They find out as it grows. And I am much more of a gardener than an architect. This kind of shows his focus when he began the series. He gave an idea of characters. He knew he wanted to write a fantasy story with magic having dwindled within the world. But he didn't have an overriding idea of where it may end up going. He may have said that, yes, there will be the Nightwalkers that will enter into the world, and he had the seed of he wanted to be interpolitics and how those politics can cause a diversion away from the real problem, which is the Nightwalkers and the growing cold and winter that is coming. But he didn't have an idea of exactly how many characters and how those characters would interact. To set the world up, though, he gave these characters backgrounds and events that kind of shaped every single character in their own unique way. Events that shared between them. The main one that we have at the beginning of a Game of Thrones is Robert's Rebellion. It is the first historical event that we really care about, and it informed most of the characters. It gives us ideas of who had an interaction with this and how it affected each one. So we have Robert, who has become king because of his rebellion against the Targaryen house. We have Ned Stark, who had fought alongside Robert and helped him build it out. And his sister was actually the driving force of the rebellion itself. We have Daenerys, who is now exiled across the world, who must try and eke out a living and find out how she can exist in a world where her dynasty has fallen. And we have Jaime Lannister, who is a Kingsguard protecting Robert, but having broken his own oath to kill the previous king. all of these stories inform our characters, and we don't get much details about it. And it's only exposed by how it affects the characters in the story. As we work through the events of the characters, we become attached to them and we want to learn more about how these events shaped them. And as Martin said himself, he is a gardener and writes where the story wants to go. He fills out more details as more light is kind of shone onto them through the characters themselves. We eventually find out with Jaime in particular why he had killed the king and how that has affected him. His ongoing struggle between family duty, protecting the common folk, and protecting the king himself, who has gone mad. And then we have other details with Ned, why is so honorable, but he has a bastard that he had sired during the rebellion. Well, he's actually protecting an oath and doing his duty in the most harsh way that he can. He cannot tell the truth about his bastard. One of the major details of A Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire that there was once an abundant number of dragons that were in the Targaryens' control well before Robert's rebellion itself. So we become very kind of interested in, well, what happened? What caused this? Why were the Targaryens have so much power and yet their dragons dwindled and disappeared from the world? Where do these kind of things come from, and how can they inform the characters that we're growing up along with in A Song of Ice and Fire? These questions, much like the character interactions that we have in A Song of Ice and Fire, become rays of light that branches grow towards. And Martin doesn't clip them. He lets them grow, and he lets them become new ways of becoming his garden even bigger and larger. Now, the one thing that we kind of need to explore as well is that we don't know any of the characters that are coming up in the story. We know general little details and how they kind of interact with Daenerys in particular, with how Rhaenyra was supposed to be queen. She was named heir, and yet they live in a society where women don't typically take or become heir. They don't become the king or the queen. They don't rule. And it informs a lot about Daenerys. So we get a lot of details around that as well. And we get details because it informs a lot of side picking, where when we are talking about in the show, particularly, Shireen Baratheon, the daughter of Stannis Baratheon, starts talking about the war. And someone asks her, well, if you had to pick a side, whether it was Rhaenyra Targaryen, or if it was Alicent and Aegon, which side would she have picked? And she says, as picking a side caused the war. She would not have picked a side because that is what caused it in the first place. So we have these mentions and we have ideas. And as well, in the books, in the very first book, we actually have a small little tidbit naming two characters in the Dance of the Dragons, as it's come to called, and what House of the Dragons is based off of. The twins Sir Eric and Eric, who fought each other hundreds of years ago when brother fought sister in the war the singers called the Dance of the Dragons. This is being told to Bran, who wants to be an honorable knight, who wants to grow up to fight wars and be honorable. So he is being told these stories of honorable knights. But why are we interested in these characters? What makes Bran so intrigued by it? Yes, it is they're twins, so there's some kind of interesting plot anomaly there. What story do we want to hear about it? What may cause them to fight? And then the mention of a brother who fought a sister. Well, why was this fight in the first place? So we get tidbits and we're kind of get our curiosity piqued up and we want to hear, oh, okay, well, the war began. Well, what caused the war in the first place? Who are these people that caused the war? And then what was the general outcome? Although we do know the general outcome is that the dragons began to disappear from the world. And although we don't want to really look into it, it's the main reason we really want to see it is because of spectacle. We want to see dragons fighting one another and we want to see a big war. But I don't think that's the main driver and why it's become what it has become. With all of this and all these intrigues, because of the way that these intricacies, Martin started writing short stories to give an outline of events in his world. He wanted to build out his world more, that he could show little details and how they're informing characters in his main story. He wrote The World of Ice and Fire, which was mostly a full-on world-building book, explaining parts of continents and different stories, as well as things in the way past. So legends of how the Lannisters came into power, the Kings of Winter. We have all of these little details that don't mean much, and they're from the perspective of a historian within the world. And then we also have small details about the rule of the Targaryens, what happened to Valyria, causing the Targaryens to leave and take refuge on Dragonstone, and eventually the conquest of Aegon, and how he had used dragons to conquer an entire continent. All of these were put into details, but it was mostly in the kind of annals style. It is not a fully fleshed out story. We have this event happened at year 300. This event happened 20 years after the conquest. This event happened. So we know the Dance of Dragons then happens at a specific date, but we don't get a lot of details, but it's niggling us. There's intrigue. There's something there. And eventually he wrote more short stories on this, which he eventually collated into Fire and Blood, which was a more detailed history book based off of the rule of the Targaryens up to the end of the Dance of the Dragons with the reign of Aegon III. I won't go into any details of who this Aegon is, but because he's the third, it's kind of hard to see with just a lot of Aegons in this story. Now, with this collated, we get some more interesting details, and we want to learn more. This was something I actually picked up and I listened on audiobook, and it's very interesting to go through and see, well, this is how the conquest of Aegon Targaryen happened, how he was able to conquer the entire continent, how he subdued two entire massive houses, destroying one entirely and completely removing the army of the other by having them go out in full force as if it was a normal battle, 10,000 soldiers with the Lannisters and the Gardeners, and then just dropping in on his skyscraper-sized dragon and completely lighting the field of fire and burning everyone. It became known as the Field of Fire for this reason. Everything just burned, and it shows the damage that can be done with these living weapons of mass destruction. And it informs quite a bit about, well, this is how the world was running before the dragons disappeared. So more when we get to the main story of A Song of Ice and Fire, we know that the power structures have dynamically changed because there is a lack of dragons. You can see the reign and power that the Targaryens had when Robert's Rebellion happened was solely because they didn't have the dragons. So it becomes more interesting. Now, in the Fire and Blood story, when we get to the Dance of the Dragons, it is called multiple things throughout the story, but the dance is the main thing that we see it as it's being told by us by singers. We see the battles and the whispers and the schemings. And the way the story is told to us is by after-fact depictions. So it is by a jester named Mushroom, Septon Eustace, and another maester. All of these collated by the maester that is writing at the time of Robert's Rebellion. And we don't get full details. We get different accounts, some which are much more explicit in saying that there was very saucy things happening, such as the way that Daemon had potentially very much groomed his niece into laying her guard, essentially. Or the fact that it was just the guard who had gone up to her and professed his love and he gets shut down, so he felt kind of out of place. So there's different accounts that are being there. And so we don't know the absolute truth of everything because it is multiple perspectives being told to us. But we find it interesting. And I think the main reason we really find it interesting is because of what we know from A Song of Ice and Fire. The first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones were very much based directly off the books themselves. And the books are so successful because everything is a character moment. Each moment that happens is driven by decisions and driven by a conflict that is within the characters themselves, not necessarily direct conflict with another character. We have Ned at the very first season who's trying to decide how to be honorable and dutiful while he is fighting against political infighting and trying to decide, well, Robert's dead. How do I go about this? I know his children are not actually his children. How can he be honorable in a place where everyone is being so dishonorable? And we see direct consequences of his actions that become an effect to him. He dies at the end of the first season and in the end of the first book. We also see Arya, who wants to be a fighter but is fighting against her own place within society. She must be a lady to be wed off. And we see her eventually leave and slowly kind of be integrated into all of these pieces of the war and see the actual devastation that come from fighting. But we also see things from Sansa's perspective as well, who is very much lady and dutiful, but sees the damage that can be done and wrought in the world solely by living in the world she lives in. And Jaime is one of the best examples of this, who, when we see the story from the beginning, he looks like the most mustache-twirling villain that exists. And yet, we find him so interesting by the time the story kind of ramps up. We learn more about where he's coming from, his devotion to his family, his devotion to duty, and the fact that the reason why he had killed the king was not because he just wanted to and wanted to take control, but because he was trying to save his father. He was trying to save the entire city from being absolutely burned by a king that was frothing mad, believing himself to become almost like a dragon. So House of the Dragon, when we start looking into the Dance of the Dragon, we know that these character moments are what are driving a lot of these events. And so this is why I think we're so invested, despite the fact that season 8 of Game of Thrones was so terrible. We know that George R. R. Martin is very involved with this story, and we know that there are going to be character developed moments that are interesting. And it's not the spectacle of the dragons. It is why the best scene of the entire season so far has been not a dragon battle, not spectacle, not fire, not sex or anything else. It is simply Viserys himself. It is his character moment where he is deciding between simply letting things be and trying to smile and laugh it off and being a king and standing up for what is right despite his own weakness at the time. And it is also with Daemon's character, who we have seen so far do some horrible things. He's been a very gray character, but we can see what conflicts he has. And most of what he wants is to look up to his brother and to be seen by his brother and to seem to have done good things for what he is. And he is helping his brother in his time of weakness. It is these character moments that define everything of Fire and Blood and why we want more of it. Not pure spectacle, but we know from where the story we have already seen and have read that these character moments will be fantastic, that they will drive this entire civil war, that it is not simply just two sides deciding that we don't like each other, there are succession issues, I want to be heir, you want to be heir, boom, boom, boom. No, it is each side having their own conflicts. We have Aegon, the king now, who doesn't want to be king. He doesn't feel like he is wanting it because he doesn't feel deserving of it. He doesn't feel any love from his family. He's not even seen by his father, who has already decided who the heir is, but he is told by his mother that he will be king. And he doesn't want any of it. He honestly is quite a terrible person with everything that he does. And I won't go into details of it, but as soon as he gets the crown and sees the crowd just cheering him on, he finally believes himself to be king and finally finds the admiration that he has been looking for his entire life, but not knowing that that is what he wants. So it is that inner conflict that makes him more interesting. And this has been the throughput of all of George R. R. Martin's writing. So even though we didn't have the details of that, the lore that we could see, we knew that once it was fully fleshed out, it would be phenomenal. And this is why something that was a way to explain a character's history and explain where they came from and what their driving force is becomes something more than just background and background history, and how it can now become a permanent piece of culture by simply being about the characters themselves. So that is all I will say about House of the Dragon for today, as well as Fire and Blood. I am sure I will talk about it in the future because there is quite a bit within the world of Ice and Fire, and especially because there are 2 books specifically designed around the lore of the world. And then there are more short stories and other rebellions that have happened throughout the history of the world in Ice and Fire, despite the fact that George has yet to finish The Winds of Winter. But I'm sure once that is released, it will be fantastic like everything else. Next time, I will be talking about Tunic, a game where the lore is kind of introduced to us and we interact directly with it through the gameplay itself and how that kind of interacts. No spoilers while I go through that, because I think that game, because it is more about the interaction of the lore, it will make it more interesting, but I'll go back into details of it. But that is all for now. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time.